rather than have Chris talk nonstop for 45 minutes, we thought we'd have him talk for more like 42 minutes, interrupted by naive questions from me, those being my area of deep expertise. Just a couple more comments about the speaker series, which is commandingly organized by Nialeti Hanwana and Liza Hogan. It's intended, as Nialeti said, to allow our grantees to share their research with a broader public than just other scholars. Chris's talk is a bit of an exception, though he is a past grantee of the foundation. He did not have a grant from us for this book, but we held one of our, what we call our master's seminars, almost exactly a year ago for Chris's book. This is a type of meeting in which we bring together a small number of relevant experts to critique, provide.
Tear it apart.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Can tear it apart in a nice way. A book in the manuscript stage to improve the final product. And it's usually a book written under our auspices, but not always. If it's a valuable contribution dealing with violence, then helping to disseminate its ideas fit with our mission. And so we, Why We Fight is just such a book, and we do take some parental pride in it. A brief bio of Christopher Blattman, PhD in economics from Berkeley, an accredited institution of higher learning. During his graduate work, for which, PhD, he had one of the foundation's dissertation fellowships, along with a couple of other minor fellowships. He also completed a master's degree in public administration in international development at the Kennedy School. Chris has been somewhat peripatetic in his teaching, having taught at Yale and then Columbia before alighting at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy in 2016. He is also the Ramalee E. Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies at the Harris School's Pearson Institute. He's affiliated with a number of centers at other universities whose researchers like Chris work on problems of conflict, economic development, and the relationship between them. He favors experimental approaches to identifying the causes of the ills he studies and clarifying what works to cure them. Is that okay? We were talking earlier about how at some events the introduction is so long that people are walking out, before it's finished. I think we've avoided that. Okay. So Chris, in this book, and by the way, it was very smart to name it after a movie that's already that appeared decades ago. It's a very clever. I'm referring to Frank Capra's propaganda films made during World War II, which were called Why We Fight, for the younger members of the audience. You've synthesized a prodigious amount of research findings from a broad array of disciplines, political science, international relations, anthropology, economics, psychology, criminology, history, some anthropology as well. And by rough count, I estimated at least 700 references in the bibliography. You probably know the exact number. But another appeal of the book, another of its strengths, is that you include among the cases of conflict that you discuss several that you yourself have studied in the field. The field being, of course, what social scientists call other people. So, you've done field work in Colombia, Chicago, Uganda, Liberia, and I'm sure other places. When did it occur to you that there were common elements, recurrent dynamics across these conflicts, and when did you realize that they could all be illuminated by the set of ideas that are distilled down in this book, which might be called a bargaining lens, ideas you're going to discuss today?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for everyone for coming. So the first time I actually got it wrong, like I got it really wrong, I remember I was in Uganda. I was having dinner with Cornelius. I was having dinner with someone else who, to this day, I think might have been a CIA agent. I'm not quite sure. And he was saying, okay, well, you're learning all this stuff. We're working in this war. There's this war that's been going on for 20 years. And you're learning all this stuff about why we fight as a scholar. Like, what does this have for us? And I started explaining that to him, what I'd learned in school. And as it was coming out of my mouth, it just seemed like nonsensical garbage that didn't apply. And I could tell that's exactly how it sounded, because I could sort of look at the expression on his face. And I would never be able to work at the CIA because I'm Canadian born, but had I wanted to work in the CIA, that was the end of my job interview. And so I did my work, and never the two worlds met until I was working in Liberia. And actually, a colleague of mine, Johnson, I think you're here. We were working together in villages about ethnic conflicts and religious conflicts, and on interventions to actually try to mitigate some of these conflicts, to help the mediation work better, to basically help there be agreements and not violence. And that's when it occurred to me that everything that was working about this program was helping people sort of find a peaceful means to settle their differences, which seems like the obvious, that's kind of what peace is, right? So conflict is ever present in the sense of disputes. And then the question is, why do we sometimes use violence? And the fact is that we need to, that a lot of this is about steering people away from the costly and damaging choice. So Mao said, politics is war without bloodshed. And von Clausewitz, the famous German general, said that war is just politics by other means. So this is what they were saying. We have this choice. And then what they neglected to say is that, although Mao hinted at, was like, one of them is just a horrible choice. And it just so happens, this bargaining lens that comes to us from political science, is that it's actually the worst of the options, and mostly we should avoid it. And so that's when it began to make clear, and it made me realize that all of the things I'd been taught could actually be applied at this level, and it sort of started me on the journey to write the book.
Right. And so before we get into the details of this framework in which war can be seen as a violent group conflict can be seen as a failure of bargaining, let me just lob you this softball. And tell me whether you agree with this, that the right way to figure out the causes of violence between groups, whether states or ethnic militias or gangs, is to look carefully at every case, every well-detailed, documented case we can lay our hands on, and trace back the processes that eventuated in violence so that we can figure out the common causes across these cases. Does that seem like a reasonable way to proceed?
Well, as Joel knows, that's what we do all the time. And I think that's not the opposite of what we should do, but we should do that a lot less. And so maybe I start off the book saying, actually, we have to remember that most of the time we don't fight. And that seems like a hard thing to say at this moment when there's a massive war going on in Europe. But it helps to point out that, first, for 20 years, Vladimir Putin tried absolutely every trick in the book, except for invasion, to try to co-opt Ukraine, right? There were assassinations and dark money and propaganda and separatist support and on and on and on and on, right? So it was the last
Getting it.
resort,
Mm.
right? And so it's a last resort. Somebody might need to get muted. Sorry, here's our sound. Is that feedback coming through? Okay. Oh. Great.
Good.
Okay, thanks. And I think we have to realize that also Putin has invaded the Ukraine, but he hasn't invaded in the same means as other neighbors, right? He's actually managed to cow Belarusians and all of the neighboring states without violence. And so if we were to ignore all those cases where there was a peace, not to say that any of it was just, but if we were to ignore all these cases of times when war wasn't used, then we're actually going to probably misdiagnose when war gets used. Is this echoing for everybody except me, or is it just me at the front?
Yeah, it's a new echo, Tony, I think.
You're hearing something.
I'm hearing me come back.
How about now? How about now?
Okay, I think we're okay now?
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. All right, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully my words of wisdom nonetheless.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's good to hear them twice.
Exactly.
Each, because
I'm like, I feel like the speed of sound shouldn't have it come there and back at me quite so
Yeah.
slowly, so.
right.
So most of the time we don't fight.
Most of the time we don't fight. And this is a big recurrent lesson in the book. And that is to pay attention not just to the dogs that bark, but to the ones that don't bark. All of the cases where violence might occur but doesn't.
And another analogy is it's like, imagine you're a doctor and you only ever saw sick people and you didn't know that there were healthy people out there. I mean, you'd be kind of depressed all the time, but you'd probably also get treatments wrong and you'd get your diagnosis wrong. And so that's kind of the thing, like we want to pay attention to the normal state of political health.
Right. So the assertion that, nonviolence is more common than violence, how do we know it's the case that intergroup violence happens less often than it might? Because, as you said a minute ago, at any given time, there are violent intergroup conflicts happening in a number of places around the world. How do we identify situations, historical or current, where we might expect violent conflict?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's different ways of doing this. So what some people have done is they say they went to Africa or Eastern Europe, where there has historically been ethnic conflict, and there's a sense, ethnic conflict is endemic. And then they counted all of the ethnic groups or ethnic linguistic groups living side by side where there's some tension, right? And then they said, how many in a given year are violent, like have an episode of violence? And the answer was about 1 in 1,000. Right, which is not nothing, and over 40 years that adds up. Like we have, just like a doctor, we have to pay attention to the sick, but it was not 999 out of 1,000. And then if you do the same exercise with nations, you find the same thing. And then some historians go back and they look at something like World War I, or they'll pick an episode, and then they'll say, well, yes, there was this crisis with, Archduke Franz Ferdinand gets assassinated and it kicks off, blah, 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 blah. We all know the story, but there were like 18 other diplomatic crises just like that one in the 10 or 15 or 20 years prior to that the exact same leaders, with all of their flaws and autocracy and incentives, managed to get right. So some of that number counting is a little hand wavy, and some of it's been well documented, but I think it's sort of pervasive.
And that's really, that's the most compelling sort of statistical evidence that has been adduced for for this argument. Okay, well, the organizing framework of the book, as I said, is one in which the idea of bargaining as an alternative to war or other forms of intergroup violence figures prominently. And as I understand it, it originated in theories about bargaining in business relationships, in economics, and was imported into international relations thinking by Thomas Schelling, the economist, most famously formalized by James Fearon, but elaborated and we hope popularized by you in this book. So it would be good to take as much time as you would like, ideally 40, 45 minutes, to elaborate on this notion. And then I might have some questions about things that are not super clear to me.
Sure. I mean, so the basic idea, which, as you're saying, is like, this is not a book about, this isn't my theory of war, everybody else's book is wrong, kind of. This is like, here's this decades of research by social scientists, but also it's a point, Mao and von Clausewitz have made. So so some people formalized it in game theory at some point, and psychologists also have added their own bit to it as well, so that we have a complete picture in every social science. But it's not, I would not sort of make it the exclusive province of one discipline. It's pretty simple. It's to say that, look, we have a thing that we're negotiating over, we both want, and maybe it's a territory, or maybe it's a policy space, or there's some issue, and we have a choice. We can either find a way to split it and come to agreement where we more or less each get what we want in proportion to how strong we are. Basically, our ability to threaten to burn the house down is unfortunately like our bargaining power here. And or we can fight over it. We can destroy a share of that pie, and then one of us can just get it, the shrunken, shattered remains, or we can now fight over the shrunken pie. And so the basic insight is it's almost always better to find a way to not shrink the pie before you split it. And that's just a powerful incentive. Now, it's not enough. I didn't write a book called Why We Don't Fight, right? I wrote a book called Why We Fight, because we do fight. But if there's one thing to remember, it's that we don't fight because war is ruinous. We can all see that right now, right? Like if anybody had forgotten, it's become palpably clear in the last couple of months. So war is ruinous. That's a powerful incentive for peace. And every answer to why we fight is a different reason that we ignored the ruin of war, right? And then the book is just about why. So there's lots of reasons. And those come to us from game theory, they come to us from psychology, sociology, but that's the one thing, because who's going to remember everything when they walk out of the room, right? But that's the one thing to remember. War's ruinous. We fight when our society or our leaders, for some reason, overlook those costs.
So tell me if this scenario sounds right. I'm going to put some numbers to this. The foundation's resources are worth $100. Mm-hmm. You and I are vying to run the foundation. We're thinking about physically fighting for control of the foundation. Now, if you and I have roughly the same estimate of our respective chances of winning, say we agree, even if we haven't talked about it, my chances of winning are 30% and yours 70%, because you're younger. That means we agree on the expected value of fighting for each of us. That is, my expected value from fighting, my best bet about what I stand to win is $30, and yours is $70. Mm-hmm. Now, if we were rational, we'd just agree to split the resources that way and avoid the cost of fighting, which might include a lot of this nice furniture, say $20 worth of destruction, right? And this loss reduces your estimate of your likely take from 70% of $100 to 70% of $80, or just $56 now. And the same calculation means my expected value from fighting is only $24. Now, if I'm rational, I should be willing to accept any split of the $100 of resources as long as it's at least $24, right? And you should be willing to accept any offer as long as it's at least $56. And in that $20 range, what would be lost in total from the fighting is the bargaining range that you spend a lot of time talking about, and things that can narrow the bargaining range or expand it. Does that seem like
I mean, that's like that's the simple sort of arithmetic that sort of says, here's this thing that game theory or even basic arithmetic gives us is that just sort of nails it down.
right?
But yeah, because it's the thing that it's that cost. But the fact that war is costly
Right.
gives us a whole bunch of outcomes that we'd rather have than fighting over it.
Right. So the idea is that, at least in theory, in any conflict over some resource, whether it's territory or governance or oil or diamonds, there is in theory a bargain that could be made, as an alternative to war, in which each side does better than their predicted gain in going to war. And so most of the book, the first half of the book is about 5 buckets of factors, 5 things that can go wrong, that take things off the rails and end up in violence between groups. And so I think it would be useful, for you to tell us about each of those.
Yeah. So war is costly. We want to avoid it. So every reason we fight is a reason we overlook the costs. And like there's it feels like there's a reason for every war and a war for every reason, which is kind of true. But I think what I try to sort of say in the book is there's kind of like 5 ways that we can organize them. And it's just a way to sort of organize that mess because you'll hear so many things. Like even with this current war, it just feels like there's this overwhelming number of explanations and like, what does it all mean? So, let me just use that as an example. So like one reason we might overlook costs is because the people who are deciding are unchecked. They're unaccountable to the people, right? So if you think of in the extreme version, you have a personalized dictator like Vladimir Putin. So he bears some of the costs of war and he's going to weigh those. But he's not accountable for so many of those costs. The people dying, the civilians, a lot of the destruction, people going hungry, that's just doesn't have to enter his calculus. And so he's going to be far too quick to use violence. That doesn't mean he has an interest in going to war automatically just because he's unchecked. It just means he's going to consider many fewer costs. And on top of that, when you're unaccountable, you might actually have a private incentive to go to war. And you've heard of these before. When people say, oh, Bill Clinton or George Bush started this war to win an election, that's a story of a private incentive, a partially accountable leader to go to war for their own well-being, not the well-being of the group. And when you hear about an autocrat who is, say, threatened by 2 democratic revolutions across the border amongst the people whom his dissidents and indeed his citizens identify with more than anybody else on the planet. And from his perspective, this is a very dangerous example. To his own people. That's a threat. It's not a threat. Democracy in Ukraine isn't a threat to Russians. It's a threat to him and his cabal. So that's a private incentive that maybe even makes him willing to pay the cost. So that's like one kind of way. And that's probably the most common reason in history for going to war, is the person who was deciding was not accountable to the costs. The second is what you could think of as ideological or intangible incentives. So think of every story you've heard about Putin pursuing personal glory. or a place in history or being the next Catherine the Great. That's an ethereal thing that's about personal glory. That may or may not be true. No one's really peering inside this man's mind, but it's plausible. That's a story of he's willing to, he knows the costs are there. He doesn't pay so many of them. He's willing to pay the costs he faces for this ethereal thing. You'll also hear a story that it's not his personal glory, but that he has this vision of national greatness for the Russian Empire and reclaiming, or people will talk about how he, like many Russians, feel humiliated by losses. Those may also be true, right? Those are also stories of these intangible incentives, these things that you're willing to pay this cost of war because you value this ethereal thing, right? And so we have so many of those. And then sometimes those incentives are noble, right? They're not. Ukrainians who face a very powerful invader who says, we're offering you semi-sovereignty. You should take this. Everybody else took this. All our other neighbors took semi-sovereignty. You should too. And they said, no way, right? So they were saying, are so ideologically committed to the idea of liberty and not having semi-sovereignty, so a much more noble and tangible incentive that's this compromise, even though it's the sensible thing to do, is repugnant. And so those are all, you don't have to agree with those analyses, but that's what that analysis, you're just saying that people are willing to undergo violence for some other goal. And by the way, that story I just told about the willingness to pay for this liberty and this ideological intransigence is the story of the American Revolution that I talk about in the book, right? Same thing, tyrannical superpower offered semi-sovereignty, and American Revolution colonists said, no way. So, okay, so now we're at 2, unchecked leaders, intangible interests. Posture.
Yeah, question, excuse me, is this the category in which we might place, fights over religious sites, say, Temple Mount in Jerusalem or the Ayodhya Mosque, perennial conflicts over physical sites that are holy to, groups at loggerheads. I guess that's no longer true with the Ayodhya Mosque since it was raised in the early 90s. But religiously inspired violent conflict, is this where you would?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a whole class of compromises that are repugnant to us. Not automatically, but that's constructed, might be constructed by our politicians, it might be given to us by an ideology, but so the idea that we would split the Temple Mount, that's an idea of like, we should split it, it's splittable, but we refuse to because it loses its value if it's shared. But that's the same story I just told about liberty. People tell this story of, well, we can't divide this thing about these things that are kind of esoteric in my mind, like the Temple Mount, whereas the thing that people refuse to split is their liberty. This is whether it's Mau Mau fighters in Kenya or the Algerians fighting for independence or the American colonists or Ukrainians, that it's just, they're saying this is not divisible. You want us to have semi-sovereignty. You want us to sacrifice some of our independence, and we refuse. And we refuse not because it's unthinkable in general, because lots of people do this, it's because it's unthinkable to us. And we will pay this violent price in order to obtain it, because some compromises are repugnant.
Yeah. And these are things that in theory could be shared, but
yeah,
they are transcendently important to these different faiths. These are places where you go to commune with God, and there's just no sharing, no splitting. Although I think there are cases.
Yeah, that's true. Well, we share. I mean, they actually do share the Temple Mount, as it turns out.
That's right.
But we do share liberty all the time, right? Like, sadly, and because there's nothing just about peace necessarily, that every autocrat or king or warlord who has subjugated their people and where there's no violent revolution, that's the powerful actor suppressing the weak actor, and there's no revolt. That's unfortunate. We of course we pay attention in history to all the violent revolutions because they do happen.
Yeah.
But they're actually, unfortunately, those are also the exception, not the rule. That's the peaceful deal when you have an extremely powerful actor on one side. That's Putin's deal with his own people. That's Putin's deal with Belarus. That's Putin's deal with Kazakhstan. And they have decided not to fight for their liberty because it would be so horrendously difficult and in pain and misery. So it's sadly the most common condition of humanity is peace, nonviolence, but oppression. Nonviolence in terms of the violent, prolonged fighting and uprising, violence in terms of this threatened repression.
Okay. So we've handled 2 of the 5 categories.
Yeah, so let me get through the others more quickly than that, sorry.
No. We've got plenty of time.
So, okay, so we're ignoring the costs because we're not accountable. We're ignoring the costs because there's something else we value. We can also ignore the costs because we make mistakes, right? We're not rational a lot of the time, but actually individuals are not rational for lots of reasons. Organizations are often not rational and persistently misinformed for slightly different reasons. So I try in the book to sort of focus on the ones that are, I think, the most commonplace that emerge. Not the mistake you make out of passions on day one, or the mistake you make out of passions or misperception when someone on the street shoots someone else on the street. I want the ones that still exist, that are still problematic on day 412 of the fighting, when there's like large bureaucracies deliberating and still not getting the right answer. Right? And so we know that human organizations have immense capacities to be overconfident, to underestimate the costs. We know that because the whole industry of mutual fund managers exists, right? Who never beat the market, but are all convinced they do. And there's so many examples. And CEOs, the fact that they ever attempt mergers and acquisitions, we have really good data on overconfident CEOs and all the mistakes they make, despite these high stakes decisions. We don't have the same data for politicians, but we all know they're sometimes overconfident. They underestimate the costs, they make mistakes. So they have these persistently erroneous beliefs. And so there's a whole class of ways in which that can lead us to war. So that's what I call misperceptions. And it's another reason we ignore the costs. And then the last 2 come to us from game theory, and they're in some sense the more subtle, and they're super important. And they're those 2 things that I was explaining to that guy in northern Uganda that sounded like garbage, but actually make a lot of sense. Okay, one of them is uncertainty. Oh, well, by the way, I will just say misperceptions, that's the dominant story for Putin, right? He's isolated, misinformed, overconfident. That's why he went in. And I think that's probably true. Experts that I know and talk to think that's definitely true. But what people underestimate is the uncertainty piece. And they kind of forget to talk about the fact that just how hard these things were to know 3 months ago. Almost every military analyst expected Russia to have a more competent military. Even people who knew that Russia had like a long history of not being that competent and just throwing men and material at a problem. But they were surprised. And relatively few people expected Ukrainians to be this plucky and brave and capable. Relatively, a lot of people were surprised by the unity of the West, Germany, Switzerland, in sanctions. And so for Russia to get a bad draw on all 3 of these things, I think very few people expected, right? It was all within the realm of possibility, but it was really uncertain. And so it's possible to make a gamble that leads to invasion under this uncertainty that ex post, we say, oh, that was a mistake, but it was not a mistake because it was a misperception. It was just fundamentally uncertain. But here's where the strategy comes in. It comes in a few ways, but here's how it comes in this situation. Everybody has an interest in resolving that uncertainty because nobody wants a war because it's so ruinous. And so the Americans and the West and the Ukraine should be like, no. We are super committed and super strong, right? We're sending all these signals of just how serious we are. And then anyone who's ever played poker already understands the game theory here, which is that you don't know what your opponent's hand looks like, and they're signaling that it's strong, and your optimal strategy is never to fold. Also, your optimal strategy is not to call every time, right? Your optimal strategy is to almost like gamble, and sometimes you call their bluff and sometimes you don't. Here, calling your bluff is a little more costly because it means invading. So that's like one of the strategic dynamics that uncertainty creates. And we tend to like jump to like, oh, he got it wrong, he's isolated and mistaken. And that's surely true, but it was also just fundamentally hard to guess. And that creates these complicated bluffing and calling dynamics. And then the last one is maybe one of the worst words in all of political science. It's called a commitment problem. So no sense whatsoever when you say it out loud. But I could make up my own nomenclature, but then I just confuse people more. So I just try to introduce it. It's a really deep and important problem to understand. It's the idea that you would like to make a deal, but your adversary can't commit to it. So in particular, and where it really often comes up, is your adversary is getting more powerful. You are temporarily powerful. So you are Germany in 1914, and you know that Russia is going to be extremely more powerful in the future, or you are the United States on the cusp of thinking Saddam Hussein might get a bomb, and that would make him incredibly powerful. So you're temporarily powerful. Or you're Vladimir Putin, and you've been growing like gangbusters in your economy for 15, 20 years. That's flattened out. And your adversary is just acquired Turkish drones, has been building their own Neptune missiles, which apparently they use to sink this warship, is getting more and more democratic and closer to the West. And in some sense, you're at your peak leverage now, because in the future, it's just going to get harder. And so political scientists and historians use that dynamic of like, let's lock in our advantage now to explain World War I and the invasion of Iraq and potentially this. Not only alone, all the other factors come into play, but this fact of like, you are at your peak leverage now, and if you don't do something, they'll get further away, is like an added incentive on top of the nationalist obsessions, on top of the misperceptions, on top of the uncertainty, on top of the uncheckedness, to like basically push you towards ignoring the costs. And because Ukraine, and here's where the commitment problem comes in. This could be solved if Ukraine said, we promise when we get those Turkish drones to be just as easy to invade. Or we promise not to get those Turkish drones in secret, cross our heart. Or we promise not to grow more democratic over time in reaction to the 20 years of horrific shenanigans you've been pulling. We promise not to grow in relative power and make this your peak leverage. They can't do that. They can't commit to that. All right, and so that's the commitment problem. So anyway. So this is how it comes together.
Regarding this towering misnomer in international relations theory, the commitment problem, can we rename it? I mean, it's leaders in conflict are not at all. They are neither incapable of nor disinclined to make commitments. They do it all the time, right? Hitler committed to not taking more than a chunk of Czechoslovakia. The problem is not that they won't make commitments, it's they're not credible, right? Can we call it from
the credibility
hereafter the credibility problem, or the right?
I wish, yeah.
Okay.
The Iraqis have a great proverb. It's if you think your enemy's going to eat you for dinner, you eat them for lunch.
For lunch, right?
And that kind of captures the essence of the commitment problem.
Right. It's a trust problem. I was going to ask you, just a little bit to elaborate a little bit on the uncertainty issue, and that is this problem in which, in estimating the other side's strength, each side has to know that the other side may be bluffing. And if I'm stronger than my opponent, I probably want to, as you say, signal that, both to deter her from attacking me, and also because it gives me greater leverage in bargaining. Now, what if I'm weaker? Is there any circumstance in which I wouldn't want to bluff? I mean, I know there's...
So often when you're particularly weak, you don't have an incentive to bluff. I mean, that's at least when you work out the models. But as a practice, so it's not you don't have an automatic incentive to bluff all the time, but nor do you have an automatic incentive to always tell the truth. There's some probability, and there's always some temptation that I'm going to play this game. And where it really gets complicated, though, is when there's lots of actors. Okay, so let me give an example. So one of the things I do is I work on gun violence between gangs and organized criminal groups in Chicago and in Medellin, where these same dynamics all play out. And one of the gang leaders I was working with was telling me how, he said, the first time they robbed our gang, and they took our drugs, I realized that if we didn't do something about it, we were gonna just be killed or just run out. It wasn't enough. We had to do something about this, or we had to get out of this business. And he said, so I ordered my guys to go and shoot one of them. And we had to do that a few more times until we had a reputation. And then they knew not to mess with us. Well, you only need reputation in a world of uncertainty. If like my strength and resolve is written on my chest or my forehead, then I don't need to do these costly signals of, that's how that also talk about gangbanging. They'd go and they'd shoot up the neighborhood, not shoot people, but they'd gangbang just to sort of send those signals. Because if someone, that's a way of signaling your resolve. You could make the same argument about the American invasion of Afghanistan, that in 2001, America was perceived as somewhat weak or unwilling to lose lives. And it had to engage in a long and costly endeavor, not just to, for lots of reasons, potentially revenge, naivete, misperceptions, on and on and on, but also, and not to leave. More importantly, because you have to explain why they stayed for 20 years, right? Even if the initial invasion was a misperception, you do that because you need to construct a reputation, like this drug gang, because you're sending a message not to the Al-Qaeda, who are at that point pretty much defeated, the Taliban, who maybe are not going to engage in international terrorism any longer, but rather to everybody else who might one day attack American soil. So that's not the only reason I think they were in there for 20 years, but I think it's the same dynamic. It's a reputation correction. It's a reputation creation in a world of uncertainty that's necessitated because of uncertainty. And we don't talk about that much, right? And so my point is not to say that explains the whole war, but just to say that we should actually at least have us understand and evaluate this and learn how to think about these things systematically, and then choose to accept or reject that as an explanation for our foreign policy.
So 5 categories of factors that can make a situation of armed hostility, or at least hostility between groups, which, situations which are, if not ubiquitous, countlessly abundant, move them into violent conflict. That's and pretty much the first half of the book. And the second half of the book is about what works, or what might work, and what works a little bit, and what works a lot. We have a pretty big quiver of interventions that can be used to try to deter would-be aggressors, would-be war makers, or to end wars in progress, or to oversee peace agreements. There are militarized interventions, peacekeeping missions by, say, the UN or the NATO, African Union. There are monetary incentives, monetary enticements, international courts and tribunals for, which can be deployed after a conflict in order, not just to serve justice, but to deter would-be aggressors, street violence interrupters, economic sanctions. So, excuse me, how does this thing go on my ear?
It's right there.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Now, speaking of reputation, is there anything I can do to recover what I've just suffered? So, what I was going to ask.
At least I have to lick something off your face or something. That would have been worse.
Okay. I want to ask you what the research literature has to say, if anything, fairly clear about the relative effectiveness of each of these interventions. And I'll just say, as you discuss very clearly in the book, this is challenging because we don't deploy interventions on a random basis across all situations where they might be applied, or at least to a random sample. So this is another selection problem, and it can go in, either of two ways, right? If we just take sanctions, if we intervene typically only in the most serious cases, with the most recalcitrant actors, Iraq, Iran, North Korea, then the success rate of this type of intervention will look dismal. And on the other hand, if we preferentially employ them, in those cases where we think the prospects for success are greatest, we'll probably credit, this form of intervention with more general efficacy than we would if it were applied randomly across a sample of all nasty situations. So, what can be said about?
Yeah. Well, let me use just two, because I know we're running out of time. So let me just use two examples. Okay, if war happens when we ignore the costs, then peace happens when something compels societies or particular leaders to consider the costs and correct those 5 mistakes. And then, of course, you have to figure out what mistakes are being made in each situation. Good example is, think of mediators, right? Why do we send mediators to international conflicts? Well, I think we send them because we think they're actually they're trying to reduce uncertainty. They're trying to reduce the misperceptions. They're also trying to find clever ways to make credible commitments, right? That's basically textbook description of what they do. It's really hard to know if they work. What I did, one of the things I was doing with Johnson was we actually did this at a village level, where we sort of empowered mediators in hundreds of villages, and then we had hundreds of villages that had not received this, and we tracked them over 3 years, and there was 0 change in disputes, right? There's still the same number of land disputes 3 years later, because disputes are ever present. People are always having disputes. But those disputes were shorter, and they were much less likely to result in violence. And so they negotiated. Now, does that work at the international level? I don't know. But actually, a student of mine who's cleverer than I am realized that he could test this in a less direct way. And he realized that, truces in civil wars are breaking out every week of the year. They're happening all the time. Often they fail. Most of the time they fail and they go back to fighting. So truces are failing, but they're trying to find, they're constantly having truces and talks because they all want to get out of this terrible state. And he said, well, and sometimes they get mediators, sometimes they don't. But you know what? In July and August, there's a whole bunch of Europeans and Americans on holiday. And those diplomats and politicians are more likely to be free to be a mediator. So you're about twice as likely to get a mediator if your talk happens to break out in July or August. Now, that's not like the world's perfect experiment, but nonetheless, he sees these peace truces are like about twice as likely to be durable than otherwise. So, it sort of comes together. And so the book is sort of full of examples where we actually can't test sanctions, for example. It feels like sanctions fail all the time, right? Because every time we seem to levy sanctions and then they break them. Well, that's because we're paying attention to we're not paying attention to all the things Putin didn't do. If he wasn't going to be sanctioned, probably would have been a nastier world. All the other Putin-like characters who might be deterred in future or have been deterred in the past. But we do actually have a lot of information on sanctions at a domestic level and at a city level when people have looked at how Latin American governments handle cartels and how US cities handle gangs and reduce shootings with programs like focused deterrence. And there the evidence is actually pretty good that when you credibly promise sanctions, and what are sanctions? Sanctions are a way to get unchecked leaders to pay attention to the costs and run against their intangible incentives and force them to maybe think harder about their misperceptions. That's what sanctions are. And they actually seem to work. Right? And that's not a magic solution. They don't work all the time, but they sort of get us a little closer. And so that's kind of what the second half of the book is about. It's about trade, and why does it work imperfectly to get us towards peace, but it does work? Or why do human rights ideologies and rights-based discussions and all these things that we do, and sort of what's the evidence, and also the fact that we could probably do a whole heck of a lot better, because right now we're kind of complacent about a lot of these tools. There's probably too little trial and error, too little innovation. And so I also highlight what are all the really promising approaches to working.
Very good. Thank you, Chris. Let's open this discussion up to questions.